Okay. Okay, so our first speaker this morning is David Vine. David is an associate professor of anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C. He is the author of Base Nation, How U.S. Military Bases Overseas Harm America and the World. It's a perfect guest for this conference. He is also the author of Island of Shame, The Secret History of the United States Military Base on Diego Garcia. David is the co-author with the Network of Concerned Anthropologists of the Counterinsurgency Manual, or Notes on Demilitarizing American Society. His other writing has been published widely, and please let's welcome David Vine.
Good morning. Good morning. This is working, and yes, it is. It sounds great. And it is great to see everyone this morning. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to speak with you. And I do want to emphasize that I want to make this a strategy session. I'm going to provide some background on the numbers, the history of this huge global network of U.S. bases abroad. But I want this to be an interactive session in which we think together and strategize together about how we do something about this situation. And I think Ajamu spoke so beautifully last night about the special responsibility that U.S. citizens in particular have to doing something about this global network of bases and the harms that they're inflicting on people worldwide. Let me just thank a few people, all the organizers, Leah Bauman in particular, all the AV folks, the folks who are live streaming. I know there are a lot of people that are required to put on a conference like this, so thank you to everyone. Also occurred to me that I think there is no better way to spend Martin Luther King holiday weekend than the work we're doing here. So I thank everyone for being here, especially early in the morning. And let's also just give an applause to all the speakers and performers last night. Thought they really got us off to a fantastic start. So let me start by saying that I think we're in a moment where we have an unprecedented opportunity to close significant numbers of bases abroad. I'll say it again, just in case anyone missed it. I think we are in a moment where we have an unprecedented opportunity to close significant numbers of bases abroad. Now, specifically, I think to do that, we have to capitalize on a moment where we, I think, can build a far broader coalition of people who are concerned about this global network of bases, far broader than we see here today, although I think this is an amazing start. We have people, high-powered people, saying things like this: the money we spend abroad is protecting other places, like we protect Saudi Arabia, we protect South Korea, we protect Germany, we protect so many other places. So I'm saying, what are we getting out of this? Which Al referenced last night, so I'm guessing a lot of people know who said this. Anyone know who said this? No, of course, this was candidate Trump. In practice, as president, basically the status quo has been maintained. And if anything, expanded slightly. Not dramatically, but the number of bases abroad has expanded slightly. Basically the same status quo with the wars, some escalation of the wars, and the number of bases in Iraq and Syria in particular. But Trump is a symbol and a sign of a growing number of people across the political spectrum who are concerned for a number of reasons about U.S. bases abroad. Now, all these people don't share the same concerns, but I think we have to capitalize on the concerns. Many of the folks on the right, libertarians, mainstream Republicans, their concerns are more financial in nature. Or they're concerned, like many in this room, I think, by the interventionist foreign policy and the series of wars that the United States has been engaged in. I think we have to make common cause with these people. It might be uncomfortable, but I think we have to work together with people across the political spectrum. And this list just includes people that folks in this room might not know about. Obviously, there are organizations like the American Friends Service Committee, others that you're well aware of, the coalition itself, that could be added to this list. But just to give you a sense, across the political spectrum, people sharing concerns of a variety of kinds about U.S. bases abroad. One other central concern that's shared even by members of the military, in addition to the financial costs, which you see reflected here from one U.S. Air Force general, in addition to the interventionist foreign policy and wars, people, including in the George W. Bush administration, based on a study carried out by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a similar study was carried out by the RAND Corporation, military analysts are realizing that the United States can deploy its forces from bases in the United States, in most cases, just as quickly or almost as quickly as from any base abroad. And any marginal time difference is not worth the dramatic cost involved in stationing forces and bases overseas. So, again, people across the political spectrum, for a variety of reasons, are arguing that the United States does not need to maintain the numbers of bases abroad that it does. That doesn't mean, again, that everyone agrees we should close all bases or that we share the same concerns, but I think we have to make common cause with people across the political spectrum. I'm going to transition now. I'm going to come back to an overview of this network of bases in a moment. But I think it's actually important to start with this map. Anyone know what this map represents? These are not, what's that? There are a lot of military installations in the area. No. This is a map of schools in Baltimore that were closed last week because they didn't have sufficient heat. This is what it looked like in school in Baltimore. Parents were raising money to buy space heaters and coats for students. I can pretty well assure you that at this new base in Vicenza, Italy, they don't worry about heat. They have schools there, multiple. I can pretty much assure you that anywhere on the base, they don't worry about heat. They, of course, don't worry about heat at Guantanamo Bay for other reasons. This is what the base at Guantanamo Bay looks like. A small or not so small American town. I can assure you that given the heat, it is extraordinarily well air-conditioned. Baltimore's schools, of course, are just a symbol of the failing infrastructure, various kinds, across our country. This is the New York City subway platform over last summer. Numerous derailments. This is the metro not far from here in Washington, D.C. that has literally killed people, numerous people, more than a dozen, I think, in the last 5 years or so. Recent Amtrak crash. I think I wanted to begin this way to underline what I think should be the urgency of our work. Because when we spend money in Okinawa, when we spend money in Germany, when we spend money in South Korea, Italy, beyond, we're not spending money on Amtrak. We're not spending money on schools. And every day that a child gets a substandard education in a school in Baltimore, or Washington, or New York, or San Francisco, that is a harm. That is damage being done. So I think we should have a strong sense of the urgency of our work, because this is where the money is. To fix those schools, to fix those parts of our infrastructure. It's in Australia. It's in Antigua, Bahrain, Guantanamo Bay, Belgium, Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, Djibouti, Greenland, Hungary, Iraq, Japan, elsewhere beyond Okinawa, the Marshall Islands, Pakistan, Qatar, Spain, UK. This is where the money isn't. So, a quick overview. And what I'm going to do is provide a quick overview, quick history, stop, take some questions for clarification, and then say a few more words about strategy, and then open things up to a general strategy conversation. Approximately 800 bases in 80 countries around the world. It's actually hard to represent them graphically on a map, given the number of bases and the constraints of a map. You can decide which is more helpful. There is no definitive list of bases, but if you want a spreadsheet in which I have tried to keep track of them as best I can over the last decade or so, it's available on my website, basenation.us, basenation.us. I can point people to it later. But by my best estimate, the United States has around 800 bases in about 80 countries. You heard the numbers about 170, 172, 176. What's that about? That's the number of countries in the world in which the United States has some number of military personnel. But the majority of those countries have just a few Marines in the embassy. So I think we need to be really careful about our numbers, because if we get them wrong, we undermine our legitimacy. About 800 bases in about 80 countries. There is a lot of expertise in the room, and there's so many bases, I'm surely going to get something wrong. Please correct me if you think I am getting something wrong. I would really welcome that. Again, because together we need to make sure we get our facts right. The first U.S. base is not Guantanamo Bay. The first U.S. base is abroad, not in Guantanamo Bay. They, of course, were on this continent, outside the 13 states. U.S. Army forts enabled the expansion of the United States across North America, the conquest of Native American peoples and nations, and, of course, the displacement and death that went along with that. Others have been displaced, and this has been part of my work. I've been able to document just since 1898 at least 20 other cases in which local people, mostly indigenous peoples, black and brown peoples, have been displaced by the construction or expansion of U.S. military bases abroad. These maps are actually, they're all available on the website as well, basenation.us in the book. Quick history. We saw the first bases abroad in North America, the first that appear outside of North America. You can see a relatively small number for this first roughly 120 years of the United States' history. The first appear in places like Alaska, Hawaii, Guantanamo Bay, Guam, Puerto Rico. A few more are built during World War I. Almost all of them close at the end of World War I. There are a few more you see in places like Panama, the Philippines. It's during World War II that this giant infrastructure of U.S. bases on other people's soil explodes. The U.S. military built as many bases as it could in as many places as it could, as fast as it could during the war. And while many bases closed at the end of the war, a permanent infrastructure of bases remained after the war and became entrenched during the Cold War. This is what the global network looked like at the end of the Cold War. You can see the total number of bases shrunk, but the basic infrastructure, the basic contours remained much the same, with, I would point to, dramatic expansion, however, in the Persian Gulf and broader Middle East, beginning in some ways in 1980 with the Carter Doctrine. The base on Diego Garcia in the middle of the Indian Ocean, I would argue, is a predecessor to that. Construction there began in 1971. And here we are in 2015. Compare the end of the Cold War. Despite the absence of a Cold War superpower enemy, the basic infrastructure of bases has remained in place. At the end of the Cold War, there were about 1,600 bases in about 40 countries. So there are about half that number of bases now, but the spread has expanded dramatically, roughly doubling to 80 countries. How's that happened? For a variety of reasons. One of them is the increasing construction of small, so-called lily pad bases, usually with a few hundred troops, not looking like the small American towns in Germany or South Korea, or again, not so small. 45,000 military personnel, civilian workers, family members at Camp Humphreys we heard about last night. Not so small at all, these America towns. But in places that have frequently not seen a U.S. military presence previously, we see the appearance of these lily pad bases with a few hundred troops, no family members, some amenities, but nothing like the theaters and schools and hospitals, bowling alleys, yoga studios that we see on bases in Germany, South Korea, Italy, Japan, Qatar, and beyond. Africa, as we heard last night, has been one of the most important places in which we see the appearance of these small lily pad bases. Again, the global network as it stands more or less today. Not much, again, has changed between 2015 and now, but some other important things to keep in mind. The vast majority of the bases in 4 countries: Germany, Italy, Japan, South Korea. But large numbers again, especially in the Middle East. Where does the number come from? Did I just make it up? No. The number is based primarily on the Pentagon's own figures from the base structure report, which hasn't appeared in a few years, and I'd be interested to talk to anyone about that. But so if you look at the Pentagon's report, their list, they count 701 bases outside the 50 states in Washington, D.C. But there are numerous well-known bases and secretive bases that don't make the list. So again, on the spreadsheet that I've put together, we get to a number of about 800. Now, you could look further into the report and say, well, wait a second, most of these are small bases. The vast majority are small bases. 560 of the 701 the Pentagon lists are small bases. But if you look at the fine print, the value of a small base can be up to $1 billion. So small is often not so small. Again, quickly, troops in about 170 countries, but again, most of those are a small number of Marines in embassies. Aircraft carriers, many of these statistics are helpfully on the back of the program. And I think it is useful to compare the total number of bases to the total number of embassies and consulates the United States has abroad. Gives you a sense of the priorities of the country, I think. Important also to note that there are other countries that have foreign bases, as Leah mentioned, and we should be concerned about them. Here's a comparison. Russia has a few, perhaps a couple dozen, maybe 3 dozen, mostly in former Soviet republics, in Syria, of course, quite dramatically, Britain and France, other European former colonies. China has its first base in Djibouti. There are at least 6 countries that have bases in Djibouti now. Japan has its first base overseas since World War II in Djibouti. And what does this all cost? By my estimates, it costs $150 billion a year, approximately, to maintain U.S. bases and troops outside the 50 states in Washington, D.C. $150 billion. That's bigger than the budget of any government agency except the Pentagon itself, and now, in recent years, the Veterans Administration. It dwarfs the budget of the State Department, for example.
Is that above and beyond the $700 billion in the military budget, or is it included in that?
Good question. It is included in that. And of course, the military budget, we need to remember. Yes. Great question was, is this $150 billion figure part of the roughly $700 billion total military budget or on top of? It's part of, and includes money from war budgets that are outside the normal Pentagon budget, normal, quote unquote.
As a leader of Delegate, I'm curious about the nuclear implications of all this.
Oh, so a question, what are the nuclear implications of all of this?
Are the bases that are outside of the traditional Cold War ones also nuclear?
Are they also nuclear equipped? I think your question points to many things. It underlines the lack of transparency in this total system and how little we, of course, know. It probably would require a longer conversation with some nuclear experts in the room, but I think it's safe to say that there are nuclear submarines, there are nuclear weapons in a number of countries outside the United States, but again, it's a closely held secret generally.
Just quickly, we keep nukes in 5 NATO countries: Belgium, Germany, Italy, Turkey, and
So,
inside of the subnuclear. But we don't actually have bombs based on the country.
thank you.
Let's wait for questions later, right?
Just quickly to underline where this comes from, Pentagon's own numbers suggest $22 billion a year for troops and bases abroad. Another estimate put it at $250 billion. By my best estimate, around $150 billion. The Pentagon budget is so lacking in transparency and so replete with errors that we can't, billions of dollars are a rounding error for the Pentagon. So we can't say precisely 156.3 billion about.
Excuse me?
Yes.
Are there any military, U.S. military bases in Israel? And does Israel have any military bases in other countries?
Good question. So the question was, are there any U.S. military bases in Israel, and does Israel have bases in the region? The United States has had secret bases in Israel for a number of years. In the last year or so, an official U.S. installation has been announced. So there is definitely a U.S. military presence, and my understanding is that there has been for years. Israel does have its first base abroad, again, announced. I am forgetting where it is. There's not an expert on the Israeli military, but perhaps someone else in the room, and I would have to look at my notes where I do have the data. Where's all this money going? It's a lot of money. Sometimes I think folks on the left who are concerned about U.S. bases abroad make the mistake of saying no one's benefiting from this. Someone's benefiting from this. That's a lot of money. It's got to go somewhere. A lot of it's going to troops' salaries, benefits for family members, but a lot is going to private military contractors, U.S. contractors and foreign contractors. And this comes from my book, a list. Kellogg Brown and Root is the top recipient. These are contracts abroad between the start of the war in Afghanistan in 2001 and 2013 by culling through U.S. government contracts. Again, so little transparency, so many errors. This is a best guesstimate. It's not a guesstimate. It's my best estimate, excuse me, based on careful analysis of U.S. government contracts. $385 billion just in contracts abroad. Why is it important to pay attention to where the money goes? I think, especially, and I want to get to the strategy soon, we need to know who are we opposed to? Who's on the other side? What constellation of power is arrayed against those who would seek to close U.S. bases abroad? This, I think, tries to map out those who are supporting the status quo. Base contractors, again, U.S. and foreign base contractors. If a base closes, they're not going to be so happy. You could see why they would have an incentive to try to keep U.S. bases open. Investors, I think we have to, not just the corporations themselves, but those who would invest in public corporations. The Pentagon and military branches themselves have bureaucratic interests, institutional interests in keeping bases open frequently. Individual military and State Department officials, their careers are often made on keeping bases open or negotiating over bases, for example, in Okinawa. Have to keep that in mind. Some politicians, not all. Why do I say some? This is, again, important thinking about the broad spectrum of folks who have concerns about bases abroad. An increasing number of people on Capitol Hill have realized that if you bring troops back from Germany, if you bring troops back from South Korea to their home states and home districts, that can benefit the local economy there. So one of the ways in which we can get members of Congress on our side is pointing to the economic benefits that can accrue in their states and districts if you bring troops home. Of course, there are foreign policy analysts, academics, journalists in the foreign policy mainstream who believe, really as a matter of faith, a kind of religious belief, in the necessity of keeping large numbers of bases and large numbers of troops outside the United States to protect U.S. national security. It's been, since the earliest days of the Cold War, really a matter of faith in foreign policy circles, mainstream, that the United States must maintain hundreds of bases and hundreds of thousands of troops to protect the United States. We have to shake up that belief and that status quo. Local elites, of course, also benefit from U.S. bases and frequently are deeply invested literally and psychologically in keeping U.S. bases open.
I would have thought that bringing troops home would be a burden on the local economy. Can you unpack that?
So the question was, and this is perfect question, and then I'll go back to some of the strategy. I would have thought, you said, I would have thought the bringing troops home would be a burden on local communities. You know, the economic effects of U.S. bases domestically and abroad are complicated. But what makes you think they would be a burden? Schools would...
If they were discharged.
So this is a major question when it comes to strategy. Are we calling for the closure of bases and the elimination of the military, not literal elimination, but the elimination of the jobs attached to those bases? Are we calling for a dramatic reduction in the size of the U.S. military when we close? So many people in the room said yes. That's great. That's great. But we should think about the consequences of that call. Are we going to piss off a hell of a lot of people in the U.S. military and people who might be related to them? So someone said we need economic conversion. I couldn't agree more. But we need to think strategically about what our call is. I think perhaps in the short term, it might be more advantageous to call for the closure of bases abroad, large numbers of them, and bringing U.S. troops home, but not kicking all those troops out of their jobs, at least not in the short term. I think there needs to be a larger conversation about what is the appropriate size of the U.S. military. But I think for strategic reasons, it might be valuable not to call for the elimination of all those troop positions. Questions? I saw over here, and then Elsa. Oh, yes.
Where's the first question?
I saw over here,
Okay.
and then Elsa, and then in the back.
Okay. One thing I'd like to say is that I mentioned last night that I was stationed in Tunisia. Tunisia does not have an American base. I was stationed at the embassy, at the Office of Defense Cooperation. And there's a handful of people that work there, but what we did was facilitate American assets coming into the country. Our Air Force lands in their air bases. We had joint military exercises. So even the countries that don't have any base at all, or not even lily pads, but have embassies, can have American troops there and have facilitated the visitation and joint work with Americans. I put that out. Okay?
Okay, to expand on what the gentleman said about it being a burden to bring the troops home, because to me, you can't just discharge them and have them come back to their communities. I mean, I know what would happen in my community in Connecticut. We're already suffering with a high unemployment rate. There are no jobs. So, I mean, that kind of a burden is... So I can understand, you know, not just discharging them. I mean, and I think we need our military. There's a real reason why every country does have a military, and it is to protect us. I think it's
Let's let everyone have their say, and I don't think it's valuable to boo other people.
I am an anti-war activist. I have been my entire life. I started with protesting Vietnam, being on Nixon's watch list. So, I mean, it's not that I don't understand, you know, people that say we shouldn't have a military. I don't think that that's being realistic, but that's my opinion only. So, but at the same time, I cannot see I want to see these bases in foreign countries closed. I think that promotes war. It doesn't decrease it. So, you know, there's got to be a reasonable way to do it, as you said. So. Yes.
And please stand so the cameras can see you on the live stream.
And if we can just ask everyone, there are already a lot of hands, so if we can ask everyone to be really brief, and then because I want to get to some of the strategy and then come back to a larger conversation.
Oh. Well, I may be coming early then. No, I was just going to speak. So to the strategy question, it might be useful to consider when assessing like where our power lies, not just like the politicians that might be in office and stuff, but also a lot of the forces on the ground where we can build alliances in terms of, you know, labor struggles, education struggles, environmental struggles, and stuff like that. It's not necessarily that we have to look to see who's already in power. We can also build it from the bottom. So
important. That was another reason I wanted to start with Baltimore. This is where the money is, and this is how we can build a broader alliance. I know Elsa and
Okay.
I think it's very important that we look at a peace budget versus an anti-war budget, because I think the statement that the sister made with good intent shows the difference. Clearly, we need to rebuild the infrastructure. I think part of your beginning was talking about the fact that the trains going off tracks, the fact that you have subway systems crashing. We truly need to rebuild the infrastructure of this country. And it certainly would be a lot cheaper and a lot more effective use of our tax dollars to do that. Now, we already have where you have programs set up that veterans get first dibbies to jobs. So we can address the issue of people being unemployed because of being taken away from the military. But we need to look at what we truly need versus what we're just against, because being anti-war will not solve our problem. We must address the issue of peace, and I think on the weekend of Dr. King, this is the message he made the clearest, was the fact that militarism has a direct effect to poor people, as he was building the Poor People's Campaign.
I couldn't agree more, and I think absolutely we need a positive message.
I'm Richard Oakes from Baltimore. Baltimore is the third largest city in the United States. We've heard of sister cities, right? Well, why doesn't Baltimore sister up with a military base somewhere in the world, maybe the 30th largest or whatever, but if every poor city in this country or people are without housing and everything else would sister up with a military base somewhere in the world, then we could visit them, they could visit us, we could share the struggle, and that would be a strategy.
I think that's a great, and I do hope we come out with concrete strategies like the last two that have been mentioned. Fantastic.
Stand up, please.
Oh, thank you. There is an annual global infrastructure report that comes out, and the U.S. is almost at the bottom of that list. Certainly, with a drastic cut in the military budget that is almost near $1 trillion, and it may be that and above because we don't know about the secret funding that goes on. We can create a program similar to the WPA under Roosevelt and have an infrastructure job creation that will deal specifically with the loss of those, quote, jobs from the military. And this is something that we need to do. Also, our housing infrastructure in this country. Barack Obama, along with George Bush, gave away not billions, but trillions of dollars to the banksters, whereas black people lost generations of black wealth. And we need to have a comprehensive view and overview of the infrastructure decline that we have that is basic to everyday living, including water. And when we look at what is happening to the water crisis in this city, how do you rebuild California with the brush fires? So we have answers. The point is, how do we get the money? Thank you.
That is our challenge. Maybe we could just take, Leah, maybe we could just take, if folks have questions about the numbers, about the specifics, then I would go back to some strategy and then open things up again because I know we're short on time. Maybe one more and then.
Well, just on the numbers of military bases, one of the things I saw on the last list that the Pentagon put out, they actually had 680 bases. But it didn't include any in Afghanistan, didn't include any in Iraq, didn't include any in Syria. There was no base in Saudi Arabia, where we know they do logistics for the Saudi bombing of Yemen. And so we know that those are incomplete lists. So the way I like to put it when I do anti-war talks is we have about 20 times the number of foreign military bases as all other countries in the world combined. And that shows you the difference, and that it is our country that is the leading country in terms of aggression around the world. And I think that's an important way to put it. I do have some questions on strategy, and maybe we could talk about those later, especially with what you said in the beginning about how we have to work with some of the people from the right wing and what that means. And I think that's an important question that the anti-war movement has to deal with. But let me just say one quick more thing. I don't think we just have to win people over on the basis that ending war is in their personal self-interest. I think we learn in this society that we are all only self-interested. But I bet if we took a poll in this room today, not one person is here because they're being paid. We're all here because we understand the devastation of war all around the world. And I think that's an important way we have to project our anti-war positions.
Here, here. Actually, could I use it again, Leah? Although I think we need to think about how we reach people who aren't here this morning. And there are a lot who aren't. Thank you. Okay, so just quickly, some lessons learned from other movements, successes and failures. I think there's a lot we need to learn from past movements, current movements. Again, their successes and failures. This is a map of anti-base protest and opposition since World War II. The global, prior global network coalition of anti-base activists, of course, were helpful in closing the base in Manta, although it's important to point out and to recognize that at a local level, having a big anti-base conference in Manta may have made things more difficult, may have actually fueled support for the base at a local level in Manta. Manta, Ecuador, I'm sorry. Vieques. I'm going to point to one or two particular sort of lessons that I think are important. There are experts in the room who know much more about all these cases and can chime in about what we can learn from and what we can avoid. Mobilization of the Puerto Rican diaspora and politicians who were willing to get arrested to close the base in Vieques. Hawaii, high-powered politicians, Senator Inouye in particular, important to returning islands from the Navy. AFRICOM, the mobilization of civil society across the African continent to block the creation of the AFRICOM headquarters on the continent. At the same time, of course, there are lily pad bases, so all these are complicated stories. Okinawa, so much to be learned from the perseverance, strength, energy of the movements, plural, in Okinawa. And they do deserve huge applause. Jeju, the use of celebrities like, where did, oh, there he is, Oliver Stone and others. Use of international celebrities to gain international attention and people willing to put their bodies in front of construction equipment. The Chagosians, the people from Diego Garcia, the use of lawsuits and strategic silences, I would say, when allying with other supporters. They have realized we don't have to agree about everything, but we can agree on the most important issues. For the Chagosians, it is their right to return to their homeland. Dalmolin, Vicenza, Italy, the use of art, creativity, even wine to fuel a movement. Who's closed the most? So it's of course a pun on vino, wine, vino, Dalmolin, which is the name of the movement. And I'll make this available to everyone. Who has closed the most U.S. bases abroad since World War II? De Gaulle. Shows us that a country can kick out not just one base, as in Manta, but all the U.S. bases. And of course, France did not dissolve, or France has survived, as far as I can tell. George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, They closed a lot of bases in Germany, elsewhere in Europe in particular. About 60% of the U.S. bases abroad closed after the end of the Cold War. Why? What can we learn from that? What did it take? George W. Bush, not my best friend, and not my favorite president, and I'm sure sentiment shared by many in the room, closed again hundreds of bases in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. At the same time, they were opening up new bases, so it's important to point out, but it shows it can be done. It's actually far easier to close bases abroad, politically and otherwise, than domestic bases, because Congress doesn't have to be involved at all. Strategies. Let's move to that quickly, so we have time for more input from others. Again, this is my website. It has information about movements worldwide, the maps, other information, basenation.us. Again, what's our strategy? Here are a few suggestions I would offer. I think in thinking about strategy, we have to think about what types of strategies. Do we have legislative strategies, protest movement strategies, the courts, can use international law, treaties, economic strategies, providing incentives perhaps for the contractors that were making so much money, giving them contracts to clean up. There'd be terrible irony, and of course, in that, but maybe we need to think about getting the contractors on our side one way or another. Conversion, absolutely an important dimension. We have to think about the scope of our strategies. Are we trying to close all U.S. bases abroad? Are we calling for the closure of unnecessary bases abroad, single bases? Where do we focus our efforts? I think obviously there's not one single strategy. We need multiple strategies, but we need to think about the geographic scope of our strategies as well. Again, thinking about the broad coalition that I think is essential. And I'm going to be organizing a meeting in DC in the coming months with people across this political spectrum, academics, think tank folks, journalists, folks from Capitol Hill, not so many, well, investigative journalists, to try to find our points of agreement, to find the shared concerns, and to generate actually a list of bases that we think should be closed tomorrow. 5, I think, shared arguments that can help build this broader coalition. 1, we're wasting billions of dollars every year on unnecessary bases abroad. You do not have to think that we need to close them all. There are bases that should be closed today, wasting billions, not being spent in schools, so we need to think about the trade-offs. Again, libertarians, others on the right, people on the left, clearly long concerned about an interventionist foreign policy and the ways in which bases abroad make it easier to go to war. Bases abroad, the defense of them has been that these are defensive in nature. The United States must maintain bases overseas to maintain global peace and security and protect the United States. No. U.S. bases abroad since World War II have not been defensive in nature. The track record, the evidence clearly shows they've been, to the contrary, offensive in nature. They've helped launch a series of wars from Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan and beyond. We need to emphasize this is an outdated Cold War era strategy that dates to the early 1950s. This is not an appropriate strategy to the world in which we live today and the threats we face. 4th, in a variety of ways, U.S. bases abroad are actually weakening national and global security. We have to take seriously, for us it's sort of self-evident, closed bases will make the world and our lives more secure. To most people in the United States, I would suggest closing bases abroad sounds like you're going to make us less secure. We need to take that belief seriously and meet people where they are and show how, in fact, having all these bases and troops abroad is making us less secure in a whole variety of ways, including by putting the military in places they don't need to be and shouldn't be. Lastly, going back to a point that was made earlier, we need a positive message. I think it can't just be closed bases. We need a positive message about reforming national security policy. I'm not exactly sure about the language yet. Reforming, realigning, renewing. I think we need a positive message. Lastly, let me just say, again, in thinking about the broader coalition, we need to think about the political spectrum, but I think we also need to look around the room and think about the relative lack of diversity here and who, again, isn't in the room in terms of age, in terms of race, ethnicity, class. We need to think about broadening the movement in ways that were suggested earlier to link with the environmental movement, the movement for affordable housing, the movement for better schools, to remind people this is where the money is. Let me just end with some words. I've got some alternatives. Let me end with some words from that former general and President Eisenhower, who said in 1953, every gun that's made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are cold, like those in the Baltimore schools, and are not clothed. I think if he were alive today, he would say, every base that's made, every base that's built, every base that's expanded, every base that's maintained signifies, in the final sense, a theft. A theft from those who hunger and are not fed, a theft from those who are cold in school or otherwise and are not heated, are not clothed. Thank you.
We don't have time for very much more, but I'm going to take 3 quick comments. Please make your statement brief. I saw the gentleman in the back first.
David, first, thanks for an absolutely brilliant presentation. One thing in terms of the opportunity, I made reference to Al McCoy's book yesterday, which is looking at the rise and decline of the U.S. empire and global power. And one of the things I think this is another part of the opportunities that are there for us. We can see that with China's rise, the United States is being pushed back from the Western Pacific. You see with Trump the alienation of the United States from Europe. And this, in turn, I think, provides a vast opportunity. You also have got the now Russian, Chinese, and Venezuelan first steps in attack on the U.S. reserve currency, the dollar as a reserve currency. That, in turn, is going to have massive economic impacts on this country. So I think those are things that we ought to be raising and adding to our arguments. Strategically, one of the things I want to point to is that come around tax day in this country, we'll have the global days of action on military spending. Last year we had about somewhere between 30 and 50 actions across the country. And it seems to me that adding this analysis, making the links, encouraging people who are here, who are talking about the Baltimore schools and where the money goes, I just encourage people to kind of link up with us on the global days of action. It's not the end of all, but it's an important step and an opportunity.
Would you give the name of Alfred McCoy's book?
Okay, Alfred McCoy's book is titled "In the Shadows of the American Century: The Rise and Decline of U.S. Global Power."
Very briefly, stand up.
Eugene Wallison, former letter carrier. McCoy's book presents an interesting argument about China creating a land bridge to Europe, going through Central Asia. They are not in wars. We are directing huge amounts of money to warfare. China is not, and it's getting away from the 11 aircraft carriers. They can have an internal market. They're developing these areas, and that presents an alternative to capitalism in the United States and really will push the United States back. And the dollar will not be secure in the long run, and the United States may very well renege on its dollar.
Leah, I saw the hand up in the way back.
I'm the lady in the corner? Yes.
She's had her hand up for a long time, I know.
Have this lady, Medea, and then this lady will be the final speaker. We really have to stay on schedule. I'm so sorry. We don't.
Thank you. My name is Linda Thompson with Metro West, and I want to address your strategy point. First of all, thank you for your book. I read it. It's excellent. I have a question on lily pads, but I don't want to deal with that now. We can talk later. I think I agree totally with broadening the coalition. We have to get the anti-war movement out of what has been called the left ghetto and reach out to all the forces. Most importantly, I think the campuses. Now, they've been focused on the environmental movement, but they aren't linking up the issue of the military bases with all the points you make in your book about how these bases are devastating the world environmentally. And that's a link we can make. And if we take over Earth Day for the spring action, it's an automatic link. And we need those students because look at the room, as you pointed out. Also on diversity, we have to reach out. And I think that positively, education, first of all, I'd like to put you on a national tour. I think we could organize one. I think the ignorance of the American population on the number of bases is appalling. I've been doing a little experiment. Go ask a person who is not in the movement how many bases they think we have. You know what they say? 15, 20, 30. We have to get out there. And I think if we bring people from different countries with the biggest bases, put them on a national tour, we've got the network nationally, and let them speak out about what the bases are doing to their countries, because every time I argue on this issue, people say, but they want us there. They want us there. We have to counter that argument. Thank you so much for the work you're doing.
Thank you.
And thank the conference organizers.
Thank you for the kind words.
Okay, two more comments. Medea and the lady in the corner. I'm so sorry. That's going to have to be it.
We have historically had a series of base realignment and closure commissions. They focus mostly on domestic bases, but they've also dealt with foreign ones. Is one of our calls for a new BRAC commission?
A great question. I think there are advantages and disadvantages, and I think we should talk about whether that should be a central call. Should Congress be more involved?
Good morning. My name is Asantwa Nkrumah Toure. I'm a member of Black Alliance for Peace. I think if you're talking about we can't close bases, then you're also telling me as an African woman living in North Philadelphia that we cannot close prisons. Mass incarceration is directly related to this issue because folks who live in some rural part of Pennsylvania where there's a prison, and they say, well, you got to guarantee a certain number of people come to this prison so I can have a job. That means if someone in my family gets caught with less than an ounce or whatever, rather than getting probation, they go to jail to fill a prison bed so somebody can have a job in rural Pennsylvania where there are very few people of color and very few young people, right? So if we want to really increase the diversity of this kind of conference and our anti-war movement, most of the people in this room are over the age of 50. Where are the young people? If we're going to bring in the young people, we're going to have to talk about the closing of schools and social services and mass incarceration and police brutality and stop and frisk so we can bring in more young people. And if we bring in more young people and more working class people, we ought to also have organized child care on site. Thank you.
As one small suggestion in response to that really important comment, I think we need to show them what a school looks like in Guantanamo Bay. Show them what schools look like in Germany. But thank you, everyone. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you, David.